Welcome to season 2 of the Mixtape with Scott. Before I introduce to you my guest today, I'd like to read you those 3 sentences from Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Lifetime of Love by Sue Johnson. We use stories to make sense of our lives. We use stories as models to guide us in the future. We shape stories, and then stories shape us. That's the end of that. So, as I've repeatedly said, this is not your typical economics podcast. It's not where you come to hear economists debate fiscal and monetary policy or talk about projected inflation or output gaps. Rather, this is a podcast devoted to the personal story of economists, scientists, and authors. I do this podcast because I'm interested in the story of 20th and 21st century economics. But I'm also interested in the personal stories of 20th and 21st century economists. In fact, I feel like you can't understand one without the other. I'm interested for their own sake. I love economics and I love economists and just am interested in the people who wrote the papers that I've read. But I also want to meet these people. I want to hear their stories. And if I'm lucky through the connection, like Sue Johnson said, maybe make sense of my own life, and which doesn't always feel sensible, and navigate it a little bit better. So today I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Derek Neal, the William C. Norby Professor in the Economics Department at the University of Chicago. For those who don't know him, Derek has had an illustrious career as a labor economist, studying things like education, wage gaps, mass incarceration, topics in personnel economics, and more than I can summarize. He's a superb, careful empiricist in the Chicago tradition, whose papers will be read, I suspect, for a while for their insights and what it tells us about American workers and American labor markets at this time in history. It was a wonderful opportunity to also just hear his personal story and just be present with him. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Mixtape with Scott. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham. Well, it is my pleasure to have on the podcast Dr. Derek Neal. Derek, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Glad to be here, Scott.
Can you tell us, for the sake of the audience, I said your name, but you can tell me your name, your job title, and who your boss is.
My name is Derek Neal. I'm the William Norby Professor of Economics in the Ken Griffin Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. And the closest thing I have to a boss is my wife, Cheryl Neal.
Neal. All right. Yeah, that covered all the bases. Good. All right. So here's an icebreaker question. What is one vacation that you took as a kid, good or bad, that to this day you kind of still think about it every now and then?
We did take a trip when I was a teenager to the Smoky Mountains. And we went because my dad's family was having a family reunion. And on his side of the family, it was kind of a once in a decade or more event. Whereas we, for years, every June had gone to a family reunion on my mother's side. And my dad was from a family where people were a little more educated than on my mom's side. And my mom had been born in this very rural area of Georgia near the Georgia-Alabama line. And he had always kind of teased her, about being from the backside of nowhere, where the road ended. And then we saw this little cabin hanging off a mountain in the Smokies where he was born. and we gave him grief about, all of this stuff about kidding mom about being from the backside of nowhere has to stop. Because this is as close to the falling off point as you can get,
That's awesome. Oh man. Okay, great. All right, perfect. That's hilarious. So so where'd you grow up anyway? You grew up in the South, but where was it?
I grew up in a little town in Georgia.
Oh.
LaGrange, Georgia. If you take I-85 and head southwest out of Atlanta towards Auburn, it's 3 Waffle Houses before the Alabama line. So that's
how you find it.
That's how you find my house, my mom's house.
If you hit the 4th Waffle House, you've gone too far. You need to go back. That's right.
No, you haven't. It's 3 Waffle Houses from the Alabama line.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. If you get off at the 4th Waffle House,
You're in Alabama.
You've gotten off one exit too early.
Oh, too early. Got it. All right.
There's 13 exits between Atlanta and the Alabama line, and 12 have a Waffle House.
Okay, that's awesome. Great. All right. So what did your mom and dad, what did your parents do for a living in that? So what was the town again? Laverne? What'd you say?
LaGrange.
LaGrange. Okay. What they do?
My dad was the guy that would in little small towns in the South in the 60s and the 70s and well into the 80s, Sears had catalog stores, and it was the original Amazon.com. Or the original, Amazon market, because they had a few things in the catalog store like lawnmowers and appliances that you could buy on the spot. Everything else you ordered out of the catalog, and then you came and had it picked up or it was delivered. And one of the things that you could do through the catalog service was you could have your house remodeled. And so if you wanted new kitchen cabinets, or you wanted a fence in the backyard, or a new roof, my dad came to your house and he did all the measurements and worked up an estimate. If you said yes, then Sears remodeled your house with Sears parts and subcontractors that my dad arranged, and he got a commission if there was a profit. That was what he did for about over 35 years. My mom was originally a clerk and then an office manager for Metropolitan Life. So they both worked for these 2 really large companies that dominated their industries when I was a kid, and then declined over time.
Oh yeah. Did they end up staying in that town after, are they still there now?
My dad passed away about 7 years ago.
Okay.
And my mom still lives there.
Oh, okay. Is it the same town when you go back? Does it feel familiar? Or does it feel kind of different?
They built a Kia plant like 10 miles away about 10 years ago. And that really changed the feel of downtown. So I could take you to some of the restaurants in downtown now and, blindfold you, drop you in there, and then take the blindfold off and tell you that we were in some kind of hipster bistro on the north side of Chicago, and you'd believe me.
It wasn't like
that. Whereas there were no places like that at all before the Kia plant.
Right. You're like, yeah, if you had done that to me, it'd been like the Sonic or something as a kid. Right. Okay. So if I could talk to your teachers in middle school, how would some of them have described you? Maybe like a couple of them. What would they have said about Derek Neal, like in the 6th or 7th grade?
Troubled.
Troubled or trouble?
Both.
Really? What kind of description?
I was very hyperactive, and very undisciplined. I wasn't mean. I wasn't getting in trouble for fighting and stuff like that, but I got in a lot of trouble for, just being unfocused on what I was supposed to do, talking when I wasn't supposed to talk, being in the place I wasn't supposed to be, not I don't think there was any kind of belligerence to it. It wasn't a matter of intentionally choosing to rebel, but there were serious impulse control problems for me well into the early high school years.
Mm, mm. What do you think that was about? I mean, not to be offended, but that sounds like attention deficit disorder or something like that.
I have no idea.
Huh.
I really don't have any idea what caused it. I'm very thankful that I had parents that always communicated, we expect you to get better,
Mm,
and you're going to get in trouble if you don't work hard at getting better.
mm-hmm.
But B, we love you and this is going to work out.
Yeah.
I mean, there was never, especially for my dad, there was never anything but quiet confidence.
Mm, mm. Yeah. That's so in high school, was it still like that in high school? Did you find yourself being pretty hyperactive and getting in trouble in high school?
It gradually got better over time.
Yeah.
But it was probably my senior year before kind of there were no issues kind of socially with other kids in terms of being picked on or stuff, and no issues with, you know, teachers being aggravated by my kind of lack of having it together.
Right. Huh. So was it disrupting your schooling? Were you like, how were your grades like?
Oh, I didn't have the grades that I should have had, but especially by high school, I had things under control enough that, you know, I would have had, you know, what people would have called good grades.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. So was it masking a little bit of your skill? You think your teachers could like just separate the signal from the noise a little bit at all?
Um, you know, my mom keeps everything.
Uh-huh.
And I found like when my dad died, we were helping her go through stuff. And I found some old report cards.
Uh-huh.
And I was shocked by two things. One was before high school, before I started to calm down a little bit, I didn't remember, you know, how many B's I got.
Mm.
Um, but the second thing was in the younger report cards, I was kind of shocked by the ubiquity of, you know, he's really smart. He can do better than this. We got to find some way to just get him to focus.
Oh, they could tell.
Well, the teachers all thought that, you know, when I was in elementary school that, you know, I was much better than my academic record, and that, you know, I needed, I mean, this was a long time ago. I mean, I'm almost 60. I think there's some chance that rather than just everybody sticking with me and letting me work it through it, I would have been heavily medicated if I had been born in 2013 rather than 1963.
Yep. Totally.
For good or for ill.
Right. So, well, did you ever have, so when you were nearing the end of high school and you kind of saw a future for yourself, what were you sort of envisioning that you would like your future to be?
Well, I had a job, my first real job, you know, where you have a social security number, was pumping gas. And I would pump gas 3 days a week and then umpire Little League Baseball at night. And I lost that job during the summer of 1980 when gas prices went from $1 to $1.25. And then I had the audacity to walk into a little news radio station that we were the county seat. And even though there was only about, you know, 30,000 people in LaGrange, there were probably 60,000 people in the listening area of this little one news radio station.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in a time when local news was a bigger deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the editor of the small school newspaper that maybe came out twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked in and had the audacity to tell these guys to hire me as a news reporter after I got fired from pumping gas.
Uh-huh.
And I had to spend about 6 months with a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Because even in small towns in the South, they want you to sound like you're from the Midwest if you're going to read the news.
Yeah.
So it took me a long time with a reel-to-reel tape recorder to become, hi, I'm Derek Neal, WTRP News. And once I got that, they put me on the air on the weekends doing the news and sending me to police stations. And then in the summers, I would cover murder trials because I was minimum wage labor and they wanted someone, there was like 5-6 murder trials a year in this county.
Yeah.
And they wanted somebody giving a report on the evening radio news when people were driving home about what happened in the murder trial.
Yeah.
And the guy that ran the radio station had been going to law school at night, and he was becoming a lawyer. And so I got very interested in courts and had a lot of fun. And so I was going to go to college and then go to University of Georgia Law School. That was my plan.
Well, was that where you got interested in economics?
Yeah, I was forced to take these distribution requirements that most colleges force you to take. And so, I had been in this first group in my high school that was supposed to, take a higher level of math and then, take calculus before you went to college, and had dropped out of that in 10th grade, telling my parents I was going to be a writer. And my parents were loving, wonderful people, and they made huge sacrifices for me. And they were great parents. They weren't, terribly well educated. My dad had gotten a 4-year degree at a night school. It was an extension campus of the University of Georgia, and was the first to graduate from college in his family. My mom was the first to graduate high school in her family. And so they didn't really know enough to say, no, you don't know what you're going to do. Stay in the higher math track. And so I showed up to college thinking I was going to be a history major and go to law school, and was very happy doing that. And then I had to take principles of econ. And about 3 weeks in, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I could make up the math deficits and actually make it through grad school, this is what I wanted to do.
Wait, so what? You were a freshman or a sophomore?
I was a sophomore. I had a late birthday, so I started college early. I was 18 years old when I started this class.
Do you remember that professor's name?
His name was Larry Wolfenbarger.
What? So, what do you think left? What was it about that class? What was it that was hitting you so hard?
I found the idea that you could write down formal models of human behavior and that they would have tangible, testable implications, so that you could do something like science. And don't get me wrong, I know we're not real scientists, but that you could do something that had the feel of science, but you were studying human interactions.
Yeah.
I found that fascinating. And also, this was not MIT.
Yeah.
So I was used to getting A's in almost every class I took.
Right.
But when I took econ classes, the two economists they had, really taught respectable economics classes.
Yeah.
Even though it was kind of a mid-level group of students. And so it would typically, be like a lot of classes I've taught over the years where the median grade was a 55.
Right.
And very few people made over 85.
Yeah.
But when I took these classes, I kept getting 98s on every test. And and it'd be 50 people in the class, and the next person down,
Like this big
was
drop.
a standard deviation and a half below.
Yeah.
And so here was something I was fascinated by.
Yeah.
And in terms of comparative advantage, in terms of relative to the other people I, knew in this little environment, I was much better at this than anything I had ever done in my life. And the year that I took this class, they had one endowed chair that was really well funded in the whole college. And they gave it to a guy who had gotten his PhD at Cornell and had written in social choice and was a real math econ guy.
Oh, he was an economist from Cornell?
He had gone to Kentucky. He hadn't gotten tenure, but he had won a lot of teaching awards, and they gave him this well-funded chair where he was making probably 50% more than anybody else in the college. And he, out of the goodness of his heart, basically offered to teach me independent study classes in the summer to try to get me ready for grad school, because this small college did not offer the classes that you would need to take. There was no analysis class.
Yeah.
There was no
so he's teaching you math class? He's teaching you analysis?
No. He taught me kind of math for economists.
Yeah.
Out of Chang and econometrics out of Johnston. In the summer between my junior and senior year to try to get me coached up, because there was also no vector calculus class to take. Wow. And so
if that guy got in tenure at Kentucky, you wouldn't even be here.
No. Greg Richardson was his name. Super smart guy. Just wasn't kind of emotionally ready for the publisher parish stuff of tenure. He had graduated, he'd gotten his PhD very young. He had started Cornell when he was 16. And he just, he was a super smart guy, but had just not done well with responding to the criticism and referee reports.
Yeah.
And he just invested his energies in me having a chance.
Wow.
And I never will forget when I graduated, I was shaking hands with him at graduation. And he said, you may have the best economic intuition of any student I've ever taught. Your math skills are still bad. And I think you're probably going to flunk out of grad school, but I really hope you don't.
That's great.
And the first class at Virginia, that was a hurdle. The first semester, there was this math stats class.
Yeah.
And it got more people than the core exams. Every year they would lose a third of the class, because if you didn't pass this math stats class, which was just how fast can I guess the trick to the integration problem, then you were off track to actually take the core exams on time. And so I showed up with 16 people in the fall of 1985.
Yeah.
At the end of that semester, there were 9 of us left.
Uh-huh.
And so that on that yellow piece of legal pad that posted the grades on the doors.
Yeah.
There were 9 names, and there was a big black line, or there was 9 student ID numbers, final grades, and a big black line, and then there were 7.
Yeah.
And my student ID and my 43 average for the class were sitting right on top of the black line. I was the lowest passing grade. And I never had a problem after that. After that, it was about economics rather than just, how fast you can crunch through the math problems.
Yeah.
And I was never in real danger after that.
Yeah.
But, people might laugh at this faculty advisor from undergrad that said, I still don't think you're going to make it.
Yeah.
But, he was only this far from being right.
That's right. It was a pretty good guess.
Yeah.
Plus or minus a point. And he got it right. Yeah. That's amazing. So you survive at Virginia. Which professors there, looking back, do you think had sort of made the biggest difference on you on the trajectory you went on?
Well, Bill Johnson is an incredibly broad and clear thinking economist.
Mm.
He understands kind of the basic models in labor, in IO, in public growth theory, et cetera. And so he kind of set this example of, you really want to understand the canonical models in economics and how they work. Now, I didn't actually accomplish that at Virginia. I had a lot to learn when I got here. But he kind of set this model of learn how to think like an economist. Steve Stern also invested an incredible amount of time in my training and career. And he really stressed, if you're going to estimate something, if you're going to write down an econometric model, let's be careful about tying the economic model you wrote down to the empirical model you're estimating.
Right.
And he was very good on forcing people to be very precise about, why is this empirical method actually a test of that model explicitly or the implications of the model? And then I would say Ed Olson. Ed Olson was an incredible mentor in that he really stressed clarity. I mean, if you gave Ed a copy of something you wrote, it was going to come back filled with red ink that was basically going to ask, not only isn't there a better and more economical way to write this, but isn't there a way to write this that's more accurate, where you're really saying exactly what you mean?
Yeah.
And I think one of the huge failures in modern graduate training now is that most people interact with their advisors through looking at slide decks for presentations. And there are just not that many advisors who say, write the whole thing out, give it to me, I'm going to read it carefully and give it back to you with comments on every page. And I try to do that because I really believe it's important. Nobody gets their slides published.
Right.
And at the end of the day, my colleague here, Fernando Alvarez, quotes one of his favorite writers who once said, writing is God's gift to us so that we know how sloppy our thinking is. And I really believe that we do our students a great service if we really invest in helping them write clearly.
Yeah. Let me ask something. So, on the website Reddit, there's these subreddits, which are like these little websites within the website. And there's this one called Explain to Me Like I'm Five, where you can ask these people on the subreddit, a question that you think is really hard, but you know that if you just ask them to explain it, you still wouldn't even understand the answer. So then you say, well, explain to me like I'm five. So this is what I want to know. Explain to me like I'm five. Why are you a labor economist? Why aren't you a macro economist or a health economist?
When I was in grad school, there's no way in the world that I had the math background to actually be successful working in a field like macro. Okay. Grad school would have taken longer. The second thing is macro has never been, because the data is just not there. Macro has never been as fully part of this paradigm that I talked about that got me excited when I was younger of here's a model, let's test it.
Right.
And so I went to grad school expecting to choose among the applied micro fields. And at that time, I took IO and I took labor. And I thought IO was a hot mess. I mean, there was just a lot of running bad regressions in 1985.
Right.
And they weren't making a lot of progress on really finding ways to estimate things that fully reflected what was in the models.
Right.
Now, 1985 was probably still before we saw a lot of progress that we would now think of and related to causal inference.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people in the 80s who were thinking seriously about let's model where the sources of unobserved heterogeneity are. Let's be very careful about the assumptions that we're making to get identification. Let's model the selection process. And you might have had to lean on parametric assumptions to get things done, but people were taking the causal questions in labor much more seriously than they were in IO.
Yeah.
And that was how I ended up in labor.
So, so you end up in Chicago. You leave Virginia and get a job in Chicago. What did that feel like getting that offer from Chicago?
Well, so you got to remember, I don't. How old are you, Scott?
47.
Okay, you don't remember. So when you applied for a job in those days, the students didn't have email accounts.
Right.
And not all the faculty at every university had email accounts. So when you applied for a job, you paid $13 to copy 3 papers and then ship them by FedEx.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I had taken the job openings for economists, and I had found like 137 places to apply to.
Oh my gosh.
It was a recession, and I'm coming out of Virginia, and I had just gotten married a few months before, and I was not going to be the son-in-law that was a freeloader and grad student who didn't get a job. And so Chicago did not advertise that fall. They got a permission to hire very late in the process. And I gave my wife the 137, and I said, right now, scratch off the places you don't want to live. and she scratched off Columbia, NYU, and Fordham. Said she didn't want to live in a dangerous city.
Okay.
And so I sent out the applications. And a few weeks later, I'm standing in Bill Johnson's office, and Bill answers the phone and he says, okay, I'll tell him. And he says, send your packet to Chicago. And so I sent my stuff to Chicago. I had already applied to the Harris School. And I interviewed with Gary Becker and Sherwin Rosen and John Cochran in the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. This was back between when the meetings were between Christmas and New Year's. And on January 3rd, I came out to Chicago and gave a job talk and visited Harris in the department. And on January 10th, Chicago made me an offer.
Wow.
And I canceled the 16 campus visits that I had set up at places like the University of Georgia and I can't even remember. Maybe Kentucky was one of places. And University of Georgia was one of the better ones. It was like Indiana State, places like that.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, what was who were your champions, you think, in that were just like, we gotta have him?
I couldn't answer that question. I know that after I got here, I was treated incredibly well by the senior faculty. And Sherwin Rosen, from that day that he called and made me the offer until he died, treated me like I was his son.
He was one of your closest colleagues?
I've never had anyone that I've had a lot of great colleagues.
Yeah.
I've never had anyone that invested more in me than Sherwin did.
Well, I'd be curious a little bit about that relationship. I mean, what was the investments you think that has made you what was he doing, and how are you different, you think?
So back then, the only place to eat lunch on campus really was the faculty club. Right. All of the places that we have now where you could go and eat lunch didn't exist really. There were a few sandwich shops that were overrun with students, and then there was the student dining halls. And so every day there was a table that was reserved for lunch at the Quad Club for some workshop. And now we have things catered, and you go to the workshops at lunch and you eat while you listen to the paper. Then there was this tradition of everybody reading the papers before the workshops. And so people would have read the papers. You would go to lunch and discuss the paper. And then at 3, you'd go to the workshops. And I got here in August, and the only place to eat school wasn't until October. The only place to eat was the Quad Club. And I went in and kind of sat by myself in the back because I really, I didn't want to go join anyone else's lunch table. And Sherwin saw me over in the corner. He was sitting at a table that Mert Miller kind of held court at. And he walked over and said, "What are you doing? You're supposed to eat with us." And that began a thing where he basically, it was kind of a de facto thing that I was expected to walk by his office and go to lunch with him every day. And I sat beside him, and lunch in those days was, you talked about economics the whole time.
Yeah.
You might talk about the paper, or it might go off into some other area of economics. And the people at that table could all kind of solve the canonical models in public and trade and IO and labor in their head. And so the conversation would just go all over the place.
Right.
And I would not understand a lot of stuff. And then on the way back, or sometimes during lunch, I would ask Sherwin, what are we talking about? And he would take me back to his office. He had this antechamber in an old building where it was set up where your secretary had an office outside your office
Uh-huh.
if you were like a full professor. And he had taken that area and turned it into a library. And he had hundreds of econ books.
Uh-huh.
And he would go in, he'd pull off a book, and he'd say, read this and we'll talk about it.
Mm.
And you know, I remember I spoke at his memorial service, and I told people that the most memorable thing that ever happened to me as a new assistant professor, I was sitting there one day when we got there early. Nobody else was there. It was just Sherwin and I.
Yeah.
And I felt his hand on my knee. And I looked, and he said, Derek, I just want to tell you that we're all really glad you're here. You fit in.
How'd that make you feel?
Unbelievable, because I had come from this kind of middle rank PhD program to, at that time, by far the best group of labor economists in the world. You had Murphy, Heckman, Becker, Rosen, Lazier, Tappel, Bob Willis, Joe, you know, Bob
Yep.
Lalonde, Canis Prendergast. I mean, it was an incredible lineup.
Yep.
And every day I felt like, oh boy, have they messed up.
Sure.
And Sherwin had this social awareness and also this kindness,
Yeah.
where he told me exactly what I needed to hear most.
Mm. Mm. Wow. Wow. That's a beautiful story. He sounds amazing. That was really I bet you feel fortunate you got to cross paths with him and be close with him like that.
Yeah, it's bittersweet,
Yeah.
because you know, I got the offer to come back from Wisconsin to Chicago uh, just a few weeks after he passed away.
Mm.
And and um uh and I came back, and my office was his old office.
Oh.
And so and and, and you can never prove it, but there's a good chance that if he hadn't suddenly gotten ill and passed away, you know, they might not have said, you know, we're getting old in labor. We've got to make more kind of senior hires at this young level.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you never know.
Right.
But it was always I mean, I would have much rather stayed at Wisconsin my whole career and had Sherwin live to be 85.
Mm. How old did he live to?
He was 63 when he passed away in 2001.
Oh, wow. Wow. Was he chair when he passed away?
No, he was chair when he hired me.
He was chair when he hired you. It was just a sudden descent in his health.
He had lung cancer, and they
Oh,
found it, and
oh gosh.
he died very quickly.
I bet the department was heartbroken. So, you know, I grew up in Mississippi, and so I've always been interested in when I wrote my dissertation about uh, racial imbalances in the sex ratio because of mass incarceration, and I wrote about it for a bunch of reasons, but part of it was I just kind of felt like studying race just felt like something I at least kind of just, at least sort of understood a little bit enough. Like, I didn't feel comfortable studying something in another country, like that. I just felt like it would have just been too exotic and I would have not been able to do it. And you've written a lot of topics in race also, going all the way back, I'm guessing, to graduate school. What was it that
No,
drew you to
no,
that?
no,
Oh, not in graduate school? I
no,
thought this JP was about, I thought your black white wage differences was from grad school. Okay, so
no,
you
had
didn't. What'd
nothing
you
to
write
do
in
with it.
grad school? What was your dissertation about?
My dissertation was when I was in grad school, the hottest thing since sliced bread was efficiency wages.
Oh,
And I and
you never hear about that anymore.
and Gibbons and Katz wrote a paper they published in 1992 in the Review of Economic Studies
Uh-huh.
that claimed that there was no one model that would explain all the patterns in the displaced worker data. Specifically, why the people displaced from the high wage industries were people who had the longest tenure and took the biggest wage hits, but were also the people that had the highest wage levels after they were displaced.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote a simple applied theory paper that was later paired with a lot of empirical work that turned into this 1995 paper I have on industry specific capital and displaced workers.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And
Oh,
then
and Jolly. Okay.
the actual applied theory paper plus the empirical work that went with it didn't get published until 1998, because by the time I had it ready to go, people were bored with efficiency wages. But it's published in the Journal of Human Resources in 1998. It's called The Link Between Ability and Specialization. And so I was working on this literature that tried to understand how ex post rents could be created through investment and sorting into jobs. And you could get patterns that looked like market inefficiencies or ex ante rents, but there was really no rationing of good jobs in the labor market. It was that if you have sorting and investment, you're always going to have ex post rents that create wage gaps that are the difference between inside and outside wages, and those are going to be bigger for able people who've sorted to specialized jobs. And so that was what I was doing. When I got to Chicago, Jim Heckman was also very kind to me, and I started attending a workshop he ran on education with James Coleman, the famous sociologist.
Yeah. Social capital guy.
And I had an idea based on stuff that I saw in that workshop about what was wrong with the Catholic schooling literature. And I started working on that project. And that paper came out after the black-white wage gap paper, but it was written well before.
Okay.
And it just had bad luck with getting an editor who was changing universities. And so when I was doing a bunch of quality checks on the data set for the Catholic schooling paper,
Yeah.
where you run regressions that you think you should know the answer,
Right.
do crosstabs, because you're looking for evidence in the descriptive statistics and the patterns in the data that maybe you created something wrong.
Right. Right.
I stumbled across the results that are in that 1996 pre-market skills paper.
Yeah.
And
what was that, for the reader's sake, for the listener? What was it you saw?
I saw that you didn't need education, that this one AFQT measure was just doing a lot of explaining, not all, but explaining a big portion of the black-white wage gap among men in their late 20s.
Mm.
And Bill Johnson had been chair at Virginia, and he was visiting Chicago for 1 quarter.
Mm.
And I went down the hall and I said, Bill, you write fast and you write very well. And I've got these results. I want you to write the first draft so that we can get a working paper, out there before somebody else stumbles across this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then at the end of the quarter, he went back to Virginia.
Mm.
And, this was before you had Dropbox and before you had Zoom or even Skype. And so I worked on it an awful lot. And then we would swap drafts back and forth. And then he asked to be the person that submitted it to journals. And when he did that without telling me, he changed the ordering of our names, because he said that, I had started the project and
Oh,
done
it's not in
most of,
alphabetical order. It's
yeah,
Neal
and
and Johnson.
he said, look, I wrote the first draft, but you did everything else, and you should get credit for this.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people think that because he switched the order that I must have done this in grad school. And and nothing could be further from the truth.
Oh.
This whole thing was just an accident. I discovered this pattern not having any intention of ever working on black-white labor market stuff, but trying to make sure there weren't any programming errors in my Catholic schooling paper.
That is fascinating.
And then Bill happened to be visiting Chicago at the time, and he is an incredibly good writer. And at that time, and he was incredibly fast at getting a good first draft. And at that time, I was at best a mediocre writer, and I was slow. And I was scared to death that someone was going to find this set of results I'd put together before I could get a paper together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it was a $20 bill laying on the sidewalk. And I think the other thing was, since the day I had shown up at Chicago, Sherwin, also Gary, but Sherwin and Jim especially, had kind of beaten through my head, think about the world through the lens of Ben Perath. Okay? And so that was the lens that I used to write the paper.
What does that mean? I don't know what they mean when they say that.
So, Ben Perath wrote this 1967 paper on life cycle human capital accumulation as an optimal control problem.
Uh-huh.
And the early literature kind of thinks about individual heterogeneity as differences in the initial skill level that you bring to adulthood. But that's really the wrong way to think about it. If you don't take logs before you start, you can't get the model to fit the data that way. And nobody gets paid in log marginal products. Wages equal marginal product of labor. But if you say, hey, this scale parameter on the front of the human capital production function, this scale parameter really tells you how efficient you are as a learner.
Yeah. And
now let's see what that will do as a source of heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Then you can take, a few minutes with MATLAB, and just by hand, you can create life cycle earnings profiles for different education groups, taking the other parameters out of the literature and just by hand spacing apart the different learning efficiencies. You can create profiles that look very much like the data. And so that was the lens through which I wrote this paper that said, if you really want to test for the existence of labor market discrimination given skill. You want it to be skill that exists before people enter the labor market. Because if you wait until after they enter the labor market, well, then two people that brought the same amount of skill could end up in different places because there was some discrimination barrier that prevented one group from investing in efficient ways using their skill. And so the way that would be most faithful to Ben Perath is to get the skill early and then look out past the crossover point, past the place where more educated people start, earning more than less educated people, and look to see how that initial condition that's a proxy for your learning efficiency would explain or not explain racial wage gaps at that point in the life cycle. And so it was all luck. I found the result by trying to check programming errors for programming errors in another paper. I was able to get the first draft written quickly because Bill agreed to write it for me. And I had the right paradigm when we started working and polishing. I had the right paradigm to frame the results because Sherwin and Jim had beaten into my head for 2 or 3 years. Think about Ben Perath. Think about Ben Perath. Think about Ben Perath.
Wow, that's crazy. The way you're telling your story, you're telling your story like there's been a lot of fortuitous events. This guy at your college and then this and meeting Sherwin the way he was. It seems like you at least tell your story like you've been very lucky.
My dad was the son of a Methodist minister. He would be very disappointed if I said yes to that, because he would want me to say that I have been blessed. And I really do believe that my life is just one big sequence of unmerited favor. There's been a lot of grace in my life that I didn't earn. I mean, and it starts with my dad. I mean, very few people in the world have ever had a father that, regardless of what was going on, was better at communicating, I love you, I believe in you, it's going to be okay. And, if you have that when you're growing up, and then you get to a situation where you say, I really love economics. I would love to try to do this as a profession. But I've never met anyone before I came to college that had a PhD. I don't have hardly anyone in my family that ever got a lot of formal education. I have no idea what I'm getting myself into. Reaching the place where you can say, I'm going to go for it anyway, and if they tell me I'm too stupid and they send me home, it's okay. Being able to have that thought process starts with having a dad that says, I believe in you, I love you, it's going to be all right. And I always knew that if I had been below that line at Virginia and got, flunked out of grad school and got sent home, they would have, my mom would have been happy because I would have been living closer to home, but there would have never been anything but, we love you, we're proud of you.
That's That's a wonderful blessing.
Yeah. And for some reason that I never understood, Sherwin, Jim, and Gary, but especially Sherwin, they all thought that I had potential that I didn't see in myself.
Mm,
And they treated me as if they expected that I had a shot.
Well, Derek, it's top of the hour. I just have so thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing with me everything. Appreciate that, knowing a little more about you. I feel so glad you're in the profession, and really thank you for your. I thank you so much for this conversation. It has meant a lot to me.
Well, I appreciate having the chance to talk to you, Scott.
All right. Well, you have a nice night.
All right. Next time I make it down to Baylor, you can buy the brisket.
That's deal. All right. I'm gonna hold. You can hold me to that. All right. Bye bye.
All right.
Gotta see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need